everybody. Welcome to Wife with a Purpose's channel. I am Ayla, Wife with a Purpose, and I hope you guys are having a great morning. I have a special interview today, and this is the first interview in what I hope is going to be an ongoing series on my channel called an elder interview. And what this is I'm basically asking people who are elders in our community and in our civilization. So I define an elder as anyone who has grandchildren. So if they've seen 3 to 4 or 5 generations, so if they've seen, their grandparents, their parents, their children, and their grandchildren, then I think they have a really amazing scope and a lot of wisdom to share with us. And so those are the people I'm going to be interviewing in this series. This is my very first one, so welcome. And thank you for joining us this morning, this early morning for some of you. I wanted to do these interviews for a lot of different reasons. And I think that our elders have so much wisdom, obviously, to offer us. And this is something that in Western culture, we've really gotten away from. Obviously, rap music or popular culture, actors and film, it tends to be geared towards the youth. And those tend to be the people that are influencing our discussions, our dialogue, our culture. And a lot of times these people, someone like Justin Bieber is influencing national culture and discussion when he's 16 years old. And obviously somebody who's 16 years old doesn't have enough life experience or wisdom under their belt to really do that in a helpful way. And so as my contribution towards moving our society back to the way it used to be, where we respected our elders, where we honored their wisdom and we learned from it, this is one of the reasons I'm doing these interviews. And the other reason I'm doing these interviews is simply to create a record. We have this wonderful equipment right at our fingertips now with YouTube and live broadcasting and recording, and it's super easy. And this is a way that we can make historical documents, really, for the future. And if we start to interview people who are elders in our communities now, we will have this going into the next, however many generations that we can keep this material around. And it can benefit people potentially for hundreds, if not thousands of years, depending on how our civilization goes. And so I think that it's really important to write this, get it written down in a manner of speaking now. And one of the reasons it's important is because the right-left dialogue that's going on in our culture and our civilization right now isn't simply, well, the left has this opinion and the right has this opinion and we go back and forth. The way that it almost was, back in the 90s when I was growing up, I often referenced the show Crossfire, where they'd have a Democrat, they'd have a Republican, they would talk about the issues of the day and kind of bicker back and forth, present both sides. And that was kind of the extent to what you did. And every time there was a national election, you had people kind of vying for that, those moderates, those people in the middle who kind of could swing either way. And the right would give their position, the left would give theirs, lower taxes versus higher taxes, immigration versus closed borders, whatever it was, and kind of try to swing those votes. But right now, with the left being in power, especially in the media and in the educational system, in colleges and public schooling, what we've seen is that not only are they okay pushing their narrative and their narrative only, but they are really actively destroying a lot of our historical documents, preservations. A lot of people call them the white ISIS because they like the terrorist group ISIS that goes into the Middle East and blows up monuments to Christians or Christian or Greek culture or whatever things that they don't like. The same way the left right now is actively destroying and trying to rewrite history. And we see this in the BBC, we see this in documentaries, we see this in the educational system. They're rewriting the books. They're even rewriting textbooks nowadays to leave certain parts of the Constitution out or to rephrase things like the Second Amendment to something that the Constitution doesn't say. And unless you can read old-fashioned script and go to the original Constitution, children are growing up not knowing that they're being taught actually false information. And so I think it's really important that we preserve an accurate history of how things were 1 and 2 generations ago, however far back we can go. We need to be talking to our grandparents. We need to be writing these things down, recording them. We need to be talking to elders in our community and making sure that we preserve this in an authentic way so that when white ISIS, when the left tries to destroy these things and rewrite history and tell us that the Romans were black or whatever nonsense they're on about, at the moment, that we can actually have at least a little snippet of our history, particularly as it relates to the 1950s and 60s, because so much already has been rewritten about that time period by the left. We want to really look at this in a fair and accurate way. And history, really, it's written by the victors. So if we want to be victorious in our cultural movement, we need to be writing the history. So without further delay, I would like to introduce the gentleman I've brought on today. His name is Stephen, and he is a grandfather. So Stephen, I'm just going to ask you to briefly introduce yourself and let my audience know who you are and where you come from.
Okay, I'm Stephen Clay, and I use the middle name because that honors my father, who is William Clay, and his father, who is Clarence Clay. I typically use just my first name when in speaking, but I like to never forget and never leave off that's who I was named. Let's see, I'm 64 years old. I was born in 1953, which puts me right smack in the middle of those dreaded baby boomers. It's a widely used target, but I'm not so sure that it's valid. I have 5 grandchildren. They range in age from 1.5 to 6, and they all live within a mile and a half of me. So we get to visit often, several times a week. They come over and gather chicken eggs and pick stuff out of the garden and that sort of thing. Let's see, for work, in 1995, I founded a software company, and I've been doing that ever since. I provide software and data services to political campaigns. And I've been involved in that end of the political process for a number of years before that. And since, let's see, that's kind of the basics.
No, that's perfect. That's perfect. That gives us a great jumping off point to get to know you and learn about your history. So tell us briefly, maybe like, you can go into as much or as little detail as you want, but like, where were you born and what year was it? And what were your early years? What's your earliest memory? Some people can remember back, before they were 5 years old. More people maybe can start remembering things around 10 years old. What were some of the highlights of your early childhood, like before your teen years?
Probably one of the things that sticks out in my mind is a blown over tree, believe it or not. I was raised in South Florida, and we had a hurricane that came through and of course, just devastated the area. And we had a big tree in the backyard, a big almond tree that blew over. And rather than doing what all the rest of the neighbors did and what they probably wish we would have done, my dad trimmed off all the little stuff and left the tree there. And that was the neighborhood playground for, probably 6 months or more, until it just got to be, till we pretty much worn it out. But that blown over tree was where all the neighborhood kids would come. My mother was a full-time mom, and Dad worked for the U.S. Weather Bureau at the National Hurricane Center, which is what brought us down there. He was one of the pioneer hurricane hunters, flying into the hurricanes in the 1940s. When I came along, my mom, I think, convinced him to stop.
That's one of the things we women do, is kind of settle your men down a little bit when it's time to start a family.
Well, that's good. That's needed. I've got 2 brothers and a sister, and they all live within about 5 or 6 miles of me. So the family. When my dad retired, he moved from South Florida up to North Central Florida, where we are now, and all us kids just kind of gravitated toward that, and that's where we settled down too.
That is wonderful. That's such a unique blessing to have in your life, to have so many generations of your family so close. I know that that's something that in the past 2 and 3 generations we've really moved away from. I know my family certainly did. I was born on the East Coast, and all of my mother and father's family was from that side of the country, but my nuclear family, my parents moved out west when I was very young, and so I grew up really a whole country removed from most of my relatives. So it is such a blessing that your family decided to stick together. I really love that. So tell us, did you have grandparents growing up when you were little? Were your grandparents around in your life, and did you know anything about them?
Oh, yes, yes. And going back to the briefly to the closeness of family, we have had an annual family reunion for I think this year will be our 62nd or 63rd annual family reunion.
Wow.
Held every June, and it's held on the family farm, and we have usually about 100 people there, or thereabouts, and it's one of the highlights of the year.
That's incredible. That is oh my gosh, that's so incredible. I'm totally envious of that.
Yeah, it still exists. It still exists.
That's beautiful. When I encourage my audience, even if you only have a few relatives nearby, or even if you're kind of spread out and you don't get along, even if you have different politics or different lifestyles, try to get together, try to get a little bit of a family reunion going, even if it's just you and a sibling or, whatever. Just start small, and those can really grow. I've seen some people start really small over the past 10 years and really grow their family reunions into something bigger. The more fun they have and the more they get together, and the older sometimes siblings get and the wiser, the more they want to participate in a fun and harmonious way in that. So I encourage especially some of my younger audience that are in their early 20s to start thinking about that, and kind of, be the person in your family that maybe leads that charge. So getting back to your grandparents then, what do you remember of them? What kind of people were they? What kind of lifestyle did they have?
Okay, on my father's side, my father's side is farm family, is as solid as you can get, and that's where the family reunion was held. And so we only saw them a couple of times a year, just because of the travel distance. But my grandfather on my father's side was very interested in progressive agriculture, learning new things. The family farm is just a few miles from the University of Florida, and he would regularly go over there and chat with the ag teachers over there, and they would come out to the family farm and just see what he's up to. My grandmother, of course, having a family of 13, was plenty busy there, and that's my grandfather on my father's side was probably not the most kid-friendly guy around. He had so many grandkids running around that, it's one of my memories of him was sitting on the back, him sitting on the back porch with his cane, and kids would come running around through the porch, and he'd reach out with his cane and try to trip us. It was funny to him, but to us, he was just a mean old man sometimes. That just happens.
I can actually totally picture my husband being that kind of grandfather. Not that my husband is mean, but my husband loves pranks like that. He loves to do things like that. Oh, wow. So that's funny. And I think that really shows a generational difference that there is there. I think men were more unapologetically masculine back then. There was a lot of teasing and just bluntness that you got from grandparents going back. That day.
I remember him trying to talk me into riding a calf, and there was a cow and a calf in the pasture right behind the back porch, and he was doing his best to convince me to ride that thing, and I didn't think so, and I'm sure my dad wouldn't have let me either, but
yeah,
fun poking at me, trying to get me to do that.
Yeah, I have. Go ahead.
I was gonna say, on my mother's side, they lived in the same area as we did. So I knew my grandmother on my mother's side much better. And she was born in Latvia. Both of my grandparents were born in Latvia on my mother's side.
Oh, how cool. I actually love Baltic culture. That's like probably my favorite. That's not ethnically mine, you know, but anyways, okay, go on. So I'm excited to hear about this.
Yeah, one story my mother told me was that when my mother started school for the first day, she came home crying, and of course my grandmother asked her why, and she said the other kids were making fun of her because she didn't speak English. And I mean, my mother was born here, but that's all that was spoken in the house, so that's all she really knew. So my grandparents made a vow at that point. There was only English to be spoken in their home at that point, from that point on, and everything worked out fine. But that's something you don't see much in the current year. You see people who've been here for decades and don't bother learning to speak English because they don't have to, and they're not part of the culture.
Yes, yeah, that actually happens a lot. But then, of course, you don't see it. I think that if you saw a Latvian family come over today, definitely they would assimilate and speak English, because if a Latvian child showed up in the public school system, there would be no Latvian, no one would be scrambling to get a Latvian interpreter for that child. It would be kind of expected that that child simply learn English. And I actually have a friend who works in the public school system, and she's worked with the interpreters and getting interpreters for children. And she worked in an area where there was a lot of Ukrainian immigrants, and the Ukrainian immigrants were simply expected to learn English, yet the Spanish and Vietnamese and other, I guess you would call like more third world immigrants were expected that they would have interpreters indefinitely. There was no push on those children or within their family group to assimilate and learn English. And I thought that that was very interesting, that we kind of have this cultural expectation that's very different for white immigrants versus non-white immigrants. But wow, so that is super interesting. So they only spoke English after that. So I guess you didn't learn any Latvian.
No. But every once in a while, there were some of her cousins and so forth came over also. And when they would get together, they would occasionally speak Latvian. I've heard it, but I wouldn't recognize it now. But they would do that. I think just kind of for old time's sake, they much preferred speaking in English, though.
Yes, I heard Latvian for the first time. Just as a little story, as a little aside of mine, I was watching TV one night, and there was an international music competition. I think I was 12 or 13, and there was this girl there, and she played violin, and she had won one level of the competition. She was from Latvia, and I never heard of Latvia before, but she played so beautifully, and she was such a lovely girl, and she spoke a little bit of Latvian, and it sounded like such a wonderful language that I immediately, this is back in the days of pen pals, I wrote to an international pen pal organization and wanted a pen pal from Latvia. It took them 2 years to find me one. They did find me one by the time I was 14, and I had this wonderful pen pal relationship throughout high school with a girl from Latvia, and she actually flew out from Latvia when I got married and was at my wedding.
Wow.
So that was really fun. So I, again, like I said, I'm not ethnically Latvian, but I absolutely love the culture, and I love the language, and I tried to learn it multiple times. There just aren't a lot of really great resources for learning Latvian because it's such a small percentage of people who speak it. We've got a couple of questions here in the chat, and so I'm just going to do another little brief introduction, and we'll go to a couple of questions in the chat before we move on. So for people who are just joining us, you are watching my first elder interview with Stephen Clay McGee, and these elder interviews are going to be about preserving our information and our heritage, and about learning and gaining some wisdom from elders in our community. And I define elder as anyone who has grandchildren, and so they've seen about 4 or 5 generations in their lifetime. And so if you want to help me continue doing interviews like this and my regular live show, don't forget, we've got Super Chat is open. You can always go to wifewithapurpose.com/support. I've got PayPal, I've got Patreon, I've got all of those good things. You can throw me a couple of shekels. I really appreciate your support. It helps me continue to be able to do this. I really have a lot of hopes for my elder interview series. I'm just going to start, I'm going to say this is interview 1, 2, 3, 4. I want to get them out there. We're going to, put them up on also on YouTube, so YouTube can never take them down. We're going to archive this information. This is for ourselves and it's for our posterity as well, to learn and to be inspired by, and really understand where we come from and where we're going. So if you want to help support that, please go ahead and do. All right, so in the chat here, let's see, I asked if there was any questions, and I know that there was one question here. It's going to take me just a second to find it. Let's see. Oh, okay, so one person, let's go ahead and we'll skip ahead to this, because I think this is something that people in my generation, especially, I think, and people a little younger than me, always want to know, is what caused the 60s madness? And so you lived through that. What did you see from that?
One of the things that, a couple of things. One, I clearly remember sometime when I was about early teens, I guess, thinking this is a crummy time to live. And you would think that, that we always think that things are worse now. Well, at that point, I saw the drugs coming in and the promiscuity coming in and that sort of thing, and I thought this is not good. I mean, I spent time watching the 50s type of TV shows, the Leave It to Beaver, the My Three Sons, that sort of thing, and this wasn't it, and that's what I wanted. So it's something that we all go through. And what's scary is when you become my age, you're going to be thinking, golly, it really wasn't that bad, because things are just progressively getting worse. And
that's a good point, yeah.
Another thing about the 60s stuff is that, I started college in 71. And there, of course, was just the tail end of that. And when you see all these videos of the campus protests and all these mobs, you've got to remember that the vast majority of the people there are just bored college kids looking for something to do, and let's see what's going on. There was a hardcore of people who were really into it, the full-time radicals. But I clearly remember hearing that, all right, there's going to be a protest at this intersection. They're going to block it off. Let's go see what's going on. And so me and my roommate and a couple other guys would just get hang around. It was on like a bluff to where you could overlook this intersection, and we were just hanging there, watching to see what happens. But we were not part of the demonstration, and that's what the vast majority of the people were. Clearly there were people who were there, wanting to raise Cain, but they were definitely in the minority.
Well, we just had a super chat come in, and I just wanted to take a pause here and thank Quebec for your amazingly generous donation, $100 from him. Thank you so much for your support. That is incredible. I'm actually trying not to cry. That was really unexpected and wonderful. Thank you so much. I love that he says with his donation, he says, love what you do. That really touches my heart so much. I'm so glad that you guys are enjoying this, and I'm so excited to keep doing these interviews. This was just something that really, when it came to my heart, I was like, I have to do this. I have to be getting this information down. Okay, so what happened in the 60s? So you're saying?
Can I let me pause for a second and comment on the fundraising part of what you're doing, and so, you've explained very clearly that, you know, that's a part of it, that's what you need to do. But there's an aspect. I've written several. I currently write several blogs, and I don't monetize them at all, and my blogs suffer for it. We tend to think that, you know, we're passionate about what we do, but sometimes, you know, if there is no real incentive, no monetary incentive that you're contributing to your family's welfare, it's easy to let that slide, put that lower on the priority list, and your work suffers for it. So I guess what I'm saying is don't ever back away. Don't ever be ashamed or embarrassed about fundraising. That's what makes your product better, or it prevents it from sliding like I have let mine sometimes.
Yes, I agree. And for me, there's two issues to the financial support. Number one, having my name out there and having people who are, well, what can I say, just really mean, horrible people. My family has to spend money on security every month. We have security costs, honestly, that are to the tune of a couple $100s a month for personal security and you know, online privacy protection and things like that, because I've had some of the people that are stalking me release you know, documentation on my family and stuff like this that could be used for identity theft and other purposes. So there's definitely, just to be able to do this and continue to do this, there's just basic costs to cover the safety of my family. But then there is, as you said, the cost of being able to get my message out. So if you love the message that I have, when you donate, you know, I'm not turning around and buying jewelry or fancy clothes or anything like that with it. I'm turning around and I'm buying ad space on Instagram. I'm buying ad space on Facebook to promote this message. And some people don't like the using the normie platforms, but I like using the normie platforms because I think that my message is such that a lot of normal people who are just kind of caught up in the everyday culture, they simply haven't heard a message of traditionalism. They haven't heard a pro-family message. They went through the public schools. They've, you know, just watching normal television. And when they hear the message, they are actually really inspired and influenced by it. So that's why I definitely, I'm on Gab and all of that. You can subscribe to my premium content there as well if you want to support me there. But, and I love to be with my people and my political people, but also I like to do the outreach on things like Twitter and Instagram and Facebook. And that's an important part of what I do too, because if our movement's going to grow, we need to get the message out there. So that is a huge part of the financial aspect. In the more I'm able to get that message out, it does take money, not only for things like ad space and time and encouragement, but also for things like legal fees, because again, having myself out there makes me susceptible to things, and you know, there are costs that come with this. And I want to just briefly give a shout out to other people who are in my position, who are YouTube content creators, who are in the conservative movement. They have the same issues I do. So if you have somebody that you especially love and you're watching their content a lot and you want them to continue, even if you just give $1 or $2, and even if you could just give $5 a month or something like that, it really does make a difference, and it does encourage us as well to be able to put out more content. And the more support I've been able to get, the more content I'm able to put out, the more quality content I'm able to put out. And it is really just a huge inspiration for me to know that you guys value that in a monetary form as well, that you really value what I do, and you're willing to put your money where your mouth is as far as supporting me. And I absolutely really treasure that. So thank you. So getting back to the 60s. So what you were saying is that a lot of this, so you had your radicals that were leading the movement. You know, when you said that, it came to mind people like Abby Hoffman and things like that, and the Chicago 7 and those sorts of people that we hear from in history. And they were really leading the charge, but a lot of the underlings were kind of just bored college kids who didn't have anything else to do, and this was kind of the trendy thing to do, maybe just to go out and participate in these protests and that sort of thing. Is that kind of the feeling that you got during that time period?
Yes, but you know, I don't want to overstate the fact. You know, clearly there was some you know, very left-leaning folks as well as the radicals, but there were also conservatives, the very bold conservatives. I remember one meeting where one political meeting of some sort. I don't remember what it was. It was a debate or something like that, and one of the left-wing guys was up there spouting his nonsense. And a guy in the back of the room stood up and pointed his finger and yelled, "No, you're wrong." And in a far left environment, that's bold. That takes some guts, and that was not common, but it was not unheard of, and it was not rare. So there were people like that. There was a during the one of the presidential run up to the presidential election, George Wallace was one of the Democratic candidate at that point, and they had a debate, a student debate, and then following the debate, all the students there present were asked to vote, who they would want to. George Wallace won that election. I mean, that straw poll on a college campus. And, that's history just doesn't record that sort of thing.
Yes, it doesn't. I actually remember learning about George Wallace in high school, and they made a movie, I believe it was starring Gary Sinise, about George Wallace when I was a teenager. And Gary Sinise, and I think it was Angelina Jolie back before she was famous and before she was married to Brad Pitt. But these kind of, they got together and kind of, rewrote his history via movie. And that's something I find that's very dangerous, and that's happening in the media a lot. And one of the reasons I'm doing these interviews to record some of the real truth, like what you just said about George Wallace, because I was given an incredibly negative opinion of George Wallace via schooling in the media, and then going back as an older adult and looking at some of those things and learning about, like you said, the straw poll and things like that. You're like, wow, I wasn't really given the full truth here. And I just want to give a shout out. My mother, she passed away 5 years ago, but she was a member of the college Republicans in her college in the early 1970s. When I was younger, I was like, how could you have been a Republican in the early 70s? That was just so not cool. And, once I hit about 30, I look back and go, wow, my mom was awesome. Well, she could stand up against that.
If we had been in going to the same school, I probably would have known her then, because I was active in the college Republicans. And in fact, that was my first political experience campaigning for Richard Nixon's reelection campaign. And talk about an unpopular stand on a college campus.
Oh my
that's
gosh,
okay.
yes.
That's what I did.
Well, I'm just so inspired by people like you and my mother, who could look at the trends that were going on at the time, as young as you were at the time, and really understand them on a deeper level, because that was something as a young person I wasn't able to do. As a lot of people know, I was very liberal in my 20s, particularly my early 20s. And I was not able to kind of see through the BS that I was being taught, not until I was older, not until I had children and I kind of had a little bit more real world experience under my belt and started going, oh, wait a minute, this actually doesn't make a lot of sense. And I'm grateful that I was able to wake up, at least in time to raise my children properly. But I completely fell into the trap of that cultural Marxism and everything that they taught me. And I was a dutiful, good little minion that came out of the public school system. So I am just in awe of people like you that were able to see through that. Oh, we've got another super chat. Thanks, guys. Spoiler alert, $10. It says, for the fancy clothes fund. Just kidding. Love your ideas and content. Thank you so much, spoiler. I really appreciate that. Okay, so let's continue with the interview. So let's see. So we talked a little bit about your parents and your grandparents, and we talked a little bit about the 60s. So what are some of the changes that you've seen in your lifetime that you find to be the most concerning? And then also, what are maybe some changes you've seen in your lifetime that you find to be inspiring? Maybe there's some things that have actually improved.
Mm-hmm. Let me, before we go on to that, one of the things that I think about sometimes that just, to me, is just kind of awesome, is how close we are generationally to what we think of as almost ancient history. There's me, and then there's my father, and then his father, which is my grandfather, and then his father was a POW in a Confederate prison camp. He was a Confederate soldier, my great grandfather.
Wow.
And that's, when you think about what that period of time was like, and there's just a couple of generations, I knew the son of a Confederate soldier, and it's not ancient history. It's very real.
That's mind blowing, actually. Like I'm sitting here like I'm at a loss for words. That's incredible to think of.
Okay, now we'll go on to the other stuff. Changes, obviously, technology. When I was in high school, math classes were taught using a slide rule, and everybody had one. And when I first started college, you could tell the engineering students, they were the ones that had a slide rule hanging off their belt. And it was, I mean, that was part of the college uniform, I guess. But calculators were just coming in at that point, and you could tell who the rich kids were because those were the ones who sat next to in class, sat next to an outlet, so they could plug in their calculator. They would add, subtract, multiply, and divide, and maybe do square roots. And so that was at the beginning of college. And about 3.5 years later, when I graduated, the slide rules were gone, and everybody had the calculators. And then I remember I took on regarding computer stuff, I took a computer programming class, and the class consisted of sitting at a big key punch machine with a stack literally about like that of key punch cards, and you would punch in one line of code at a time. You take the stack of cards to the girl behind the counter, and she would put them in the machine, and 15 minutes later, she would call out your name, and here's your program. And you get a stack of green bar paper, and that was your printout. That was the results. And later on, I took another programming class, and I was talking to the instructor afterwards one time after class, and he said, I was telling him how much I enjoyed it, and he said, the day will come soon when you'll be able to afford your own computer. I thought, you're crazy. Here I've got, let's see, I don't know how many computers we got here in the office, but that of course is that's just mind-boggling to me.
Mm-hmm. Definitely. Well, even in my lifetime, I've seen so much technological change, but yeah, the slide rules that almost causes me anxiety. I'm really glad I went through math class in the time of calculators.
Yeah.
Because I could barely do it with a calculator, so I don't know what I would have done with a slide rule. So technology definitely. So do you feel that technology has been overall a positive thing that it's grown so much, or is it a mixed bag? I know some people kind of look at it as a mixed bag because now obviously we don't have the slide rules anymore. And we do have internet in our home, but then, we have challenges. I know as a mom, now I have to be really careful about what comes into my household through the internet as far as what my kids can see. And there's so much available out there, that I have to be. I know back in the days when I was in, junior high or so, and there wasn't an internet, if boys wanted pornography or anything like that, they kind of had to go break the lock on the dumpster at the 7-Eleven and try to pull out a Playboy or something like this. But now it's all at our fingertips. So do you see it as kind of a mixed bag, or do you see it like that it's we just have to be a little bit more vigilant? But that's the key.
The technology is good. are we have not caught up with it. We have not caught up to the technology, and the gross decline in morals is just a huge thing, and that's all tied into it too. My cousin and I were talking some about, what is the biggest overarching problem. Why have things gone downhill so bad? And our conclusion was that it is the decline of Christianity in this country, and it's not just the decline in Christianity; it's what is replaced it, which is the religion of secularism. And secularism is every bit as much a religion as Christianity or Islam or anything else, because it asks you to believe things that take things on faith, and which is basically the definition of any religion, is taking things on faith. But secularism asks you to take things on faith that are just absurd, that everyone is equal. Well, logic tells you that's absurd, but the true believers of leftism, they could care less. They cannot be dissuaded, and you see that everywhere. One of the things that I remember when I was in my teens, I guess, I was in a department store and heard two men who were over there in the hardware section, and one of them was looking for something and was using profanity, and that was a shock to me, because nobody used those kind of words in public. It was a shame to do that. And in private, of course, people always have done it in private, and always have, always will. But people were genuinely ashamed to do that in public. Not anymore. And that was just the start of it. That's just a thing that really hit me. And you could look at the way people dress, the way they talk, their excuse for music. Just everywhere you look, it's the decline of Christianity and the rise of secularism. And secularism is every bit as dangerous as Islam. To our culture.
Oh, definitely. I completely agree. And I'm really glad that you brought up profanity and the use of profanity, because I think this is something that gets overlooked, particularly among conservatives these days. I think unless you're typically like a very religious person whose religion specifically says, maybe not to use cuss words. And, coming from my background, I'm thinking about Mormonism. Mormons actually kind of, there's not really a doctrine against cussing per se, but it is definitely one of those rules in the church that you're taught not to use profanity. But maybe like for Catholics or a lot of Protestant denominations, they don't really have that rules per se, or they don't really emphasize that within their culture. But I really find that to be so important. And I had that experience in my life where growing up, we weren't allowed to use cuss words, obviously at home or anywhere else. And there was also other words that my parents said we weren't allowed to use. Like, I wasn't allowed to say "that sucks," which was hard because growing up in the 90s, that was a really common term that all my friends used, oh, that movie sucked, or whatever. But I wasn't allowed to say that. At home, my parents were actually quite strict, and like a good little rebel, when I got to be a teenager in my early 20s, the first thing I wanted to do was use profanity. And so I did, but it made me feel horrible when I did. And I just kept thinking, well, maybe if I just keep using it and I get used to using it the way all my friends do, and the way, the movies are doing, then I'll feel better about it. And I never felt better about it. And then I got into my mid-20s and I just said, you know what? I really need to stop cussing. Like, I don't feel good about it. And this was right around the time I was starting to look into Christianity and things like that, but I hadn't really got into it yet. One of the very first things that I did that I guess I would say is culturally Christian was start to watch what I said and start to try to remove those words from my vocabulary. And then I found was really hard. Once you start cussing, it was really hard to stop because your brain gets weak and you're not used to thinking of those other terms that you can use. It's really lazy thinking just to say, oh, F this or blah, blah, blah. It ends up being very lazy thinking to try to put in a different descriptive word there. And so I just kind of started out with using some alternatives, just alternative words, and then trying to kind of, reshift my vocabulary. But it's very hard. But it's one of the things that I just, as a plug, would love to see more people in the conservative movement these days who are my age and younger really focus on, because you see a lot of YouTube content creators out there that are conservatives or libertarians or alt-right, and they really cuss a lot, like not just a little to emphasize every now and again something that's a very serious situation, but it's like every other word is the F word, this and that and that. And so I would love to see a return to just watching our mouths a little bit more. I think that it really makes a difference. And the way I heard it really well described was actually by Dennis Prager, who's a conservative radio host. And he said, if you went to a doctor's office, and the doctor was like, oh, your effing leg is effing broken, and started using all of these cuss words, would you respect that man? Would you want to go back to that doctor? Would you feel like he was a good doctor and like he could do surgery on you? No, it actually, your opinion of him would go down. And we've stopped thinking about what other people think of us and wanting to be respectable. And language is one of those places that it starts. And then that moves into what you were saying about, the way people dress now and the way people act. We all see those viral videos of people cussing out, somebody in a Subway restaurant, or starting to, throw punches at the mall, and these sorts of things that was not acceptable behavior even when I was a teenager, and especially going back to when you were a young person as well. And these are small cultural changes, something like language, and just bringing back the shame of that, the shame of like, you shouldn't be cussing and yelling and starting fights, or, these sorts of things in public, that there's an idea that in public we have a certain behavior level. Would you agree?
It's a general decline in civility. And one of the things that just absolutely amazes me is when I see some of the videos that you're describing, people who are clearly on the right, and it's like, don't you see who you're imitating? You're sounding exactly like the urban street thugs that you're criticizing. And language is one of the key components of culture. Any culture is partly defined or largely defined by the language, and it just doesn't make any sense.
Oh, 100%, 100%. And you will see that in complex societies that have really intricate civilization, we have more complex language. And I think that that's something that gets overlooked, and people forget that. And again, there's that intellectual laziness that cussing falls back on. And it is kind of like this caveman barbarism of just making these grunts and guttural sounds instead of really thinking through a more articulately worded position. And obviously not everyone is articulate, and I understand that. But for those that are, especially these content creators out there in conservative politics, if you are articulate enough to have a YouTube channel and all of that, then you can definitely find some better words to use than just throwing out the F word all of the time. So that's my mommy spiel against cussing. And I'm really glad that you brought that up, because that is definitely something that has changed radically. I still, even in my lifetime, when we go to a hotel or something and I turn on the TV for a minute, even things like the History Channel or the Learning Channel, and they'll throw out some of these words, and I'll be shocked. I'll go, oh, you could never have said that on television when I was growing up. Oh my gosh. So,
well, we removed television from our home sometime in the mid 1990s, I think, and have never looked back. We don't want that sewage pumped into our house.
Yes, yeah. Definitely, and that's the same way with my family. We haven't had network TV or cable at all. Basically, since we've had children, that was a big thing for me. I spent a couple of years actually before having children weaning myself off of television. I kind of grew up again, in that generation where TV was always on. I was a big MTV fan. So I grew up as a teenager. I had a TV in my bedroom and I watched MTV all the time. And I was used to that background of television and that sense of being connected, I guess, to the wider world through a television broadcast. This is, of course, before the internet. And so I actually did have to wean myself off of that. I started listening to radio talk shows and things like that instead. So I could have the screen off and listening to radio, and then kind of transitioning to being okay with being in silence and being with my own thoughts. And I think that's something that a lot of people don't even know how to do anymore. And I know that some people will have over to our home and we don't have a TV, and they're visibly uncomfortable because there isn't kind of that glowing screen that they're used to gathering around to kind of fill in those silent gaps. And so they kind of feel uncomfortable. But that's something that we've chosen as a family just to accept. And there might be a time when my father comes to stay with us for long periods of time as he ages. We have a room in my house for my dad. And at that point, my dad will probably want some television. He's really a fan of football and things like this. So we might get it for my father. But if we were to ever get television again, that's what it would be for. We wouldn't be using it in our family. And I think that is, you're very wise to have done that in the 90s. I think that's really when things went completely off the rails as far as television goes, and it became just not worth it to have anymore. So definitely, I encourage my audience, if you have, I'm sure most of you have given up the TV. If you haven't yet, I encourage you, especially nowadays with the internet, if you want to watch a TV program that actually is good and edifying and uplifting, you can almost always find it on Amazon Prime or Hulu. I don't recommend Netflix for obvious reasons, but you can find it out there. Almost everything that you would want, you can find on the internet, and you can just watch things a la carte and kind of build your own media experience and not be susceptible to all of the commercialization and then obviously the negative content. And then also just that addictive quality of television, of always feeling like you need to have it on and you can't be alone with your own thoughts. And I really encourage people. I think that's something that's changed a lot probably in your lifetime. What with the phones and everything now is that, people used to sit and think back in your day. I know my grandma used to tell me, like, let's just go sit on the porch and be quiet and think. And I was always like, why? That seems really boring. But you get to really experience your thoughts and kind of think deeply when you allow yourself that space. And I imagine people back when you were younger had more of that space.
We probably did, but I didn't recognize it.
Yeah.
Not seeing what is going on. I'm afraid we may be running short on time, but one of the things that I really wanted to put a plug in from my generational perspective is the importance of homeschooling. Our two sons were homeschooled, and now our grandkids are being homeschooled. And for anybody who, for whatever reason, doesn't have their own kids to be able to homeschool, there is a lot you can do to help those who are skills that you're able to teach the kids, or just simply buying the homeschool materials for others, because the stuff is not cheap, but it's incredibly important. That's having seen what has changed in the school systems in this time is just there's no way I would want my grandkids going to a public school.
Oh yes, I think that can't be overemphasized enough, and that's definitely something that I've talked about. And I absolutely love your perspective that a variety of people in the community, not just people who have children, can help support homeschooling families, whether that be with your time, your talent, or even financial support. And you can also support private schools if you have a good private school, and those are hard to find too. But if you do happen to live in a larger community that maybe has a good conservative private school, you can also donate for scholarship funds and things like that, or you can pitch in with some friends and help send your nephew or your niece or somebody like that to that school. Maybe if your siblings don't have the money to send their kids to private school, maybe your sister works, whatever the situation is. But definitely looking around in your community, even if you don't have your own children yet, and seeing how you can help the children in your community meet some better financial, or not financial, excuse me, educational, have some better educational attainment, I think is wonderful. And for those who don't know, who don't have children, you can always get on Facebook, and almost every community has local homeschooling groups. And certainly, you know, there's even local homeschooling bookshops and things like that. And you could always, you know, go in there and say, hey, I'd love to, you know, put $20 down for the next family that comes in here that they can spend on some materials or supplies or however you want to do that. But paying it forward is really helpful. And actually, getting back a little bit to the Mormon thing, in early Mormon history, that was what they emphasized when they were first settling Utah, is they said, look, we want to have our own schools. We don't want other people from outside of our community teaching our children. It will not work out for us. And they actually stuck to that for a little bit, and then they got away from it. People got lazy and wanted to use public schooling. But one of the things that they were always saying is, well, I can't afford to pay for, you know, the Mormon schools, because obviously they had to charge money because they had to employ a teacher and whatnot. It wasn't a public school. And the leaders at the time really encouraged people to go to grandparents, go to, you know, uncles and aunts and neighbors and other people in the community and say, would you be willing to help support this effort of sending my children to the community school that we've built here instead of what they called back then the free schools, which became the public school movement. But at any rate, we've got one question here, and then I think we're going to wrap up pretty soon. It says, what is Stephen's opinion of his own generation today? So how do you feel about, you know, a lot of the baby boomers get a lot of flack, especially from the young people who kind of look back and feel like a lot of people in your generation dropped the ball. You know, how do you feel about your generation in general?
Well, I think it's important to realize that generations don't do things; people do things. It's the individuals. You'll find a range of people from successful people to absolute losers, no matter where you look. If you look at what is going on right now, you've got folks in their early 20s who visualize themselves going down in history as the noble Aryan leading the charge, and you know, everything's perfect. But that history could also show that they're just a bunch of crybaby snowflakes that are looking for safe spaces. You just don't know, and history is written by the victors, and so you need to be really careful about lumping an entire generation, because it just doesn't work that way. Generations don't do anything. They're just a convenient way of grouping, putting a group of people together, and that's useful. That, you know, I don't want to say that nobody should ever use generational terms, because you need labels to be able to describe things, but generations don't do anything.
Yes, definitely. I think that's a really great point to close on, is that when we're looking at anything, politics, society, culture, there's looking at it on the macro level and there's looking at it in the micro level. That's, you know, recognizing when generalities are useful and recognizing when looking at individuals is useful. And I think that's one thing that we've seen lately in public discourse is kind of people either want to look at generalized groups all the time and only associate with groups, or people are hyper individualistic and only ever want to look at individuals and never consider the wider group influence, whether that be politically, socially, culturally, religiously. So we'll go ahead and wrap it up. I just want to tell everybody who maybe have tuned in, we were having what I'm calling are my elder interviews. This was my very first one with Stephen Clay McGee. And these are interviews I'm going to be doing with people who are elders in our communities. So I define an elder as being a grandparent. So 4 or 5 generations that they've been able to see. we just want to record their stories. We want to learn from their wisdom. We want to have a great dialogue like we've had in the chat session today. And I want to thank everybody who participated in that. Thank you so much for the super chats and the donations. I really, truly appreciate your support. This support helps me bring you this content. Check me out on Gab. I've got premium subscriptions over there too. Gab AI, Wife with a Purpose. And if you are a grandparent or you have a grandparent that would like to be interviewed for my elder interviews, please get in touch with me. My email is whiteayla, A-Y-L-A, @protonmail.com. You can email me there, and I'm willing to work with whatever situation that you might have. If your grandparent needs to stay anonymous, if you need to help them set up the recording equipment, maybe they're not too savvy with that, and you need to stay anonymous, but maybe they can be on screen. If your grandma wants to wear sunglasses and a mask, that's fine too. Grandmas, grandpas, and they don't have to necessarily even be conservatives or their whole lives or anything like that. I just want to get their opinions. I want to record their experiences and see what wisdom they have to share with us. So definitely get in touch with me if you are a grandparent or you have a grandparent that might be interested in participating in my interviews. And then, Stephen, I want to thank you so much for being with me today.
My pleasure. I enjoyed it. I didn't think I would, but I did.
I'm really glad. Yes, it went so well. You were the perfect first guest to have. I think your points were marvelous. Well, I want to wish everybody a wonderful Monday. I hope you guys have a great week. I hope you were able to take something from this interview. Please remember to like this interview, share, subscribe to my channel, and I will talk to you guys later. Thanks so much.